Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. Here's your host, Nick Giordano. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast on whatever podcast platform you're on. Also, share this episode with your family and friends, and don't forget, follow me on social media at P.A.S. Report. Now, the government shutdown is officially over. Last week, we saw 8 Democrats cross the aisle. They voted with Republicans to reopen the government, but we have to ask the question, what about the nearly 40 Democrats? You know, it seems they were quite content to keep the shutdown going. In fact, the outrage from Democrats, it's really astonishing because they wanted to blame Trump for the shutdown. They wanted to blame Republicans for the shutdown, and they were doing everything they could to blame them. But the Democrats' reaction to reopening the government demonstrates that they were the ones that shut it down, and they wanted to keep it shut down. 43 days. 43 days, and what did they accomplish? It was political theater, you know, the finger pointing, media hysteria. And for what? It wasn't about national security. It wasn't about the border. It wasn't about inflation. It wasn't about crime. It wasn't about debt. It wasn't about authoritarianism, like they like to say. No, the government shutdown was for 43 days because one party, the Democrats, wanted to put on a show for the American people. Because this could have ended a month ago. We had an election coming up, and they didn't want to get their radical base upset before the election. That's what it really came down to. It shows that they're not serious about governing. And I could say that with certainty. Not only did they reopen the government following the election, but throughout the entire shutdown, they were arguing about the COVID Obamacare subsidies. See, they don't want to give up these subsidies that were created during a national emergency, and subsidies that they actually put the expiration date on. And this whole political theater, what did they get out of it? Okay, so I'll have an up or down vote in December. But what it really does is demonstrate how broken the system really is, because I want you to think about that for a second. The United States, the most powerful country on earth, was held hostage so that Democrats could win elections and protect entitlements. If that doesn't tell you everything about where we are as a country, nothing's going to. And let me ask you something right at the start. If we can't even allow a temporary pandemic subsidy to expire, what do you think happens as these programs grow bigger and deeper, as they become more entrenched, more permanent in our lives? What do you think happens when entire voting blocks, entire industries, entire state governments become financially dependent on Washington? Do you think anything good arises out of that? And more importantly, what do you think happens to freedom in a country where more and more people can't imagine a life without government, can't imagine a life without government taking care of their every needs? See, this shutdown, it didn't really reveal a budget dispute. What it did do is reveal something that's much more serious, something that is much more dangerous, the growing dependency of the American people on the federal government. And this isn't just about low-income Americans. Understand the middle class, even the upper class, they continue to demand more subsidies, more entitlements, just because. I mean, if you look during the Biden administration era, the electric vehicle subsidies, who was buying electric vehicles? It wasn't low-income people. It wasn't people living in poverty. It was the wealthy elite. They didn't need subsidies. They could afford those cars on their own. See, the problem in America is that Americans themselves have become conditioned to want government in their lives. They want government involved in the healthcare system, involved in their finances, involved in all their decisions. And the more programs grow, the more people rely on them. And the more people rely on them, the more impossible it becomes to ever shrink the government down. See, dependency expands, freedom contracts. We saw it after 9/11. We saw it after the mortgage meltdown crisis. We saw it after the pandemic. They use these national emergencies to get more power, more control over our lives, and the American people just give it without asking any questions. See, real freedom, the kind the founders talked about, it wasn't the freedom to get a government handout from Washington. That's not freedom. It wasn't a freedom to outsource our own personal responsibility to some government agency, to some bureaucrat. Real freedom was built on self-reliance, discipline, grit, the simple idea that you should be able to stand on your own 2 feet without a bureaucrat dictating the terms of your life. But today, people want that. They want the government to dictate to them. And we're heading in the opposite direction of what the Founding Fathers wanted. We have a record number of Americans that now live in households receiving some type of government assistance. And as more and more people come to depend on the state, there's going to be fewer people willing to challenge its authority. See, you can't bite the hand that feeds you. If government's taking care of your health, your education, your housing, your food, you're not going to go and criticize that. And that brings me to something that Britt Hume said last week, something that perfectly captures the moment we're living in, because the shutdown wasn't about avoiding harm. It was about protecting the politicians. It was about protecting the bureaucrats. It was about protecting the government apparatus. It wasn't about the poor. It's not about compassion. It's about refusing to give up one more entitlement program, no matter how temporary, no matter how unnecessary, no matter how expensive. And I want you to take a listen to Britt Hume, because I don't think anyone said it as clearly as he does. Take a listen.
If we cannot, as a nation, decide not to continue a subsidy that was imposed or was enacted during a national health emergency and was designed to be temporary, and that all the Democrats voted to have be temporary, if we can't let that expire, what hope do we ever have of getting government spending under control?
That right there is the question. And it's not just about this one subsidy. It's about the entire structure of government spending in America. If the political system cannot return to normal after an emergency, if every crisis becomes a permanent program, if every temporary measure becomes a lifelong entitlement, then government isn't just growing. People's dependency is growing as well. And once people are dependent on the system, they're nothing more than a slave to the state. The election of 2 weeks ago should be an eye-opener. You have two avowed socialists, two avowed communists, essentially, who won their elections. Mamdani here in New York City, Katie Wilson over in Seattle. They basically ran on entitlement galore and even campaigned on the notion that they're going to be soft on crime but tough on businesses. That would have been a losing campaign slogan just 20 years ago, yet here they are, that's winning. And given their success, think about how many more committed socialists and communists will be running for office in 2026 that are going to make these grand proclamations for more free stuff. See, next week I'll do a whole episode on the Democratic Socialists of America. What is the socialist agenda? And I'll break it down for you step by step. But the truth of the matter is, anyone that dismisses the socialist platform, you're doing it at your own peril. You're doing it at the peril of the United States, because the attraction of getting more stuff from the government, it's persuasive. People don't want to take the accountability themselves. And the government's going to grow, dependency is going to grow, and the America envisioned by the Founding Fathers, it drifts further and further away. Yet these people will make significant gains all because of what they're promising. Doesn't matter that it's failed every single place it's been implemented. That's irrelevant. And it's amazing because they'll constantly say, well, we're talking about democratic socialism. We're talking about the kind of Nordic and Scandinavian nations. As I explained that last week, those nations are more capitalist than we are. We have more socialist programs here in the United States than they do there. And when you look at it, they're not, the Mamdanis of the world, the Katie Wilsons of the world, they're not talking about what the policies over in Scandinavia or the policies over in the Nordic nations. Those nations aren't talking about closing down prisons. Those nations aren't talking about defunding the police. Those nations aren't talking about free transportation. They're not talking about controlling housing and taking control over the inventory stock. They're not talking about attacking businesses. See, the socialist vision is actually based on Venezuela and Cuba. They don't say that out loud, but that's the truth. And we've been falling for it for years, because when we look at the numbers, it's eye-popping. Everyone, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on, ask yourself, would America survive if we shrank entitlements even a little bit? Could our political system survive simply by just telling the people no? Maybe, and I know this is a novel idea, maybe we have politicians that actually are statesmen and women, where they try and temper the expectations of people, where they explain to the people, we know you might want this stuff, but here's why it's not good. Because I believe we could function as a society if we get rid of 5%, 10%, 20%. We cut it in half and nobody would ever really notice. Because sooner or later, they're going to have to get out there on their own feet. See, when you're just handing people stuff, there's no incentive to do better. And what happens when there's no incentive? Well, people just keep demanding more and more and more. It's scary. And then ask, how many Americans today would truly be able to survive on their own without the dependency that's been built into the system? How many would collapse the moment the entitlement stopped? And how many would have to figure out, have to get a job and work, earn, better their lives, better their children's lives? See, this shutdown fight didn't just expose a political fight. It exposed how pathetic we become, how fragile of a people we've become. It exposed how many people, including entire state governments, whose budgets, 25% of their budgets, rely on the federal government. And I'm taking that as an average. Obviously, in all 50 states, it varies from state to state. But when we look at it, how many of them cannot function without Washington picking up the tab? And I'm going to break this all down. The growth of these programs, the fraud, the abuse, the impossible math, how dependency is spreading into the middle and upper middle class. And yes, how immigration policies have made it worse. Because they did, and you're being lied to out there. First, we have to understand how we got here, how entitlements grew from small targeted programs into the massive, massive parallel economy that they become, now touches nearly half the country. And I'm going to explain it all. So hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. Now, if you're enjoying this episode, if you find this episode informative, because that's what we like to do here. We like to inform. We like to educate. I want to give you, the American people, the breakdown of these policy issues outside of a 3.5 segment media clip from any of the news stations. Because every American should stop and think. 127 million people. 127 million people. That's how many people in this country live in a household receiving some form of means-tested government assistance. So you're talking about over 1/3 of the American people receiving government assistance. We're talking cash, food, housing, healthcare, school lunch, you name it. 127 million. This is not a fringe group of people. It's not the margins of society. It's not the downtrodden. It's close to 4 in every 10 Americans. And the question we have, how did we get here? How did we get here? How did a nation built on the idea of self-reliance and independence end up with almost half the country connected to government social safety nets? And the truth is, it didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly and quietly, like they usually do, program by program, crisis by crisis, and each expansion. It seems small at the time. It seems contained and that you could manage it. But when you add it all together, you start to see something different. You start to see the government rivaling the private sector in size and influence. And that's never the way it was supposed to be. That was never the intention. And I want to walk you through how this happened, because once you understand the evolution, the current dependency crisis, it becomes impossible to ignore. You know, you go back to FDR's New Deal, but really, let's take a look at the 1960s. You had Lyndon B. Johnson, his Great Society program. Now, at the time, welfare was narrow, few million people, cash payments, a safety net. By the 1990s, everything exploded throughout this period. So 1960s to 1990s, and it's only gotten worse since. But the rise of food stamps, public housing, welfare, healthcare, all these things. Programs that seemed limited. And what happened? Well, they multiplied. And it not only did the programs multiply, but we made it easier to be eligible for these programs. And that's the biggest shift. See, the government, the Clinton administration working with Republicans, they did welfare reform. And everyone was like, oh, that's great. We're getting people off welfare. Yeah, but we stopped welfare, and what did we do? Well, we started giving everything else. And when direct cash welfare collapsed from 14 million people in the 1990s to about 2 million people today, politicians said, look, we fixed welfare. But they didn't. They just changed the packaging of it. So today, let's look at these numbers. You have 18.5 million people that live in households receiving some type of direct cash assistance. 18.5 million. You have 41.7 million receiving SNAP food benefits. 88.1 million live in households with someone on Medicaid. Over 9 million people receive federal housing subsidies. And again, 127 million live in a household receiving some type of means-tested benefit. That's not a safety net. That's not a safety net. That's a crisis right there. And that's the government taking control, increasing its power. And the support for these programs, it never ends. It never dies. If nearly half the country is connected to government funding, how do you ever shrink that system? How do you cut programs people rely on for food, for housing, for healthcare, for cash? Well, you can. Well, you can, but the politicians won't because they won't get reelected. I'll say it time and time again. You have two politicians running for office. Candidate A tells you we're going to do the responsible thing. We're going to cut budgets across the board. We're going to cut them down 20 to 30%. We're going to get rid of a lot of these social programs that exist, programs that have been abused, programs where we see an enormous amount of fraud. And listen, we're going to see pain during this transition. There is going to be pain. But at the end of the day, America will be fiscally responsible. We do this for a few years. We'll be able to pay most of our national debt down. We'll be able to save over $1 trillion in interest down. It will be a literal golden age. But you have to sacrifice in order to get to that. Candidate B comes along and says, he hates your kids. He wants to cut education spending. He hates veterans. He wants veterans that sacrifice so much for this country. He wants to cut spending on veterans. He doesn't want us to be safe, at a time where China is rising, where China is testing the United States and challenging us for superpower status. He wants to cut the Defense Department's budget. He wants to create national security risks. And they'll go through a litany of things. And then they'll say, well, I want to cut taxes on the middle class. I want to increase investments in your child's education. I want to increase investments in veterans, increase investments in our national security, increase investments in our housing. And they'll go through a litany of programs where they don't say we want to raise spending. They say we want to invest. We want to invest in the American people. And people buy into it like seals. Even though candidate A is the one that's much more responsible, even though the candidate A is right, you're not going to vote for the person that says, I'm going to make your life more difficult. You're going to vote for the person that says, I'm going to make your life easier, and here's a whole bunch of stuff to do it. So when we look at programs, understand these government programs, they create political constituencies. Once someone receives a benefit, is that person really going to vote for the candidate that says we're going to take it away? Once we have these agencies and departments expanding, their payrolls expanding, do you think the bureaucracy is going to say, oh, well, it's too much? People have become too dependent on us. We have too many employee staff. Do you think that the bureaucracy is going to say, no, shrink our budget? Or do you think they're going to ask for a bigger budget, ask for more staff, ask for more power? When you look at temporary programs becoming permanent, COVID subsidies, housing vouchers, emergency Medicaid expansions, once they're created, they just simply stay. And unfortunately, you have a whole bunch of politicians who are rewarded for giving these programs, rewarded for supporting these programs. Every program has a natural bias towards growth. And the kicker is every new program creates new dependency, which creates new demand for more programs. Dependency is what feeds government growth, and the government growth feeds dependency. It's a never-ending cycle. And while this is all happening, you have fraud exploding. Medicaid fraud. Estimates run as high as 20 to 40% when you factor in undocumented workers, off-the-book income, fake addresses, people claiming to be single when they're really married, people claiming children when they don't even live with those children, providers billing for services that they never did, clinics running assembly line scams. When we look at SNAP, still major problem. You have trafficking going on, fake retailers skimming taxpayer dollars. And there was just a report, 5,000 dead people getting SNAP, 5,000 dead people getting SNAP, 500,000 people are double enrolled. They're enrolled twice in the program, getting monthly benefits 2 times. Housing fraud, people living in subsidized units they don't qualify for, renting them out illegally, hiding their income. Is anyone going to ask the new mayor how he got his rent-subsidized apartment, rent-controlled apartment, even though he comes from a wealthy family? Might be a question you might want to ask. And the part that no one wants to admit, fraud isn't a glitch in the system. It's part of the system. It's built into the system. Whenever you create massive entitlement programs, there's not really strict oversight. We see the abuses. They become inevitable. How much money was wasted with the PPP programs? The PPP programs during COVID. Over $1 trillion in PPP loans? I mean, the whole thing's ridiculous. And I want to ask you directly, you, the audience, what do you think? Do you think the system is too large, that it's too complex? Do you think that the politicians and the bureaucrats are ever going to roll it back, dial it down? Do you think politicians have the courage to say no to millions of people receiving benefits? And as far as voters go, will voters ever choose personal responsibility over dependency? These are serious questions because they're questions we have to face honestly if we care about the future of this country. It's one thing when American citizens manipulate the system, but far too many have made it a norm in their lives. Far too many have taken advantage of these programs. We see the fraud, waste, and abuse. We see how it's costing the taxpayers, the ones who wake up every single morning, the ones who go out there and do the right thing. We're talking billions upon billions of dollars a year. But not only that, what about how we've imported dependency from all around the world? What happens when millions of illegal immigrants enter the country and get folded into the welfare formulas? Now, people will say that's not happening. Democrats will say, well, no, if you're an illegal immigrant, you don't qualify for these programs. Yeah, but there's loopholes and caveats. And what happens when states begin to create a parallel program that gives benefits to people who shouldn't even be eligible? I was reading an article the other day by saying, we can't get rid of the food stamp program because it sustains economies. It provides, $200 billion into the economy each and every year, and it's helping the businesses, the grocery stores, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, no, if these people were able to go out and not live off the system and get jobs and actually pay for things themselves, nothing changes in the economy. But we can't do that. And this is why it's such a big problem. And then you factor in the illegal immigrants, and it makes it much worse because the federal government, no, they don't qualify for benefits. And then you have the federal government under the Biden administration that quietly reimbursed those states through agencies like FEMA and Health and Human Services. And I don't think people understand how bad this problem is. So I'm going to wrap it all up in the next segment. Everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report. Now, if you find the content of this episode informative, make sure you share it with family, friends, post it on social media. You could tag me at P.A.S. Report and follow and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. Because we're talking about how this dependency culture, the entitlement culture, is destroying the United States. The hundreds of billions of dollars each and every year going to these entitlement programs. And some people truly need it. Listen, for the single mother out there that's working 3 jobs and trying to make ends meet, I'd rather give her government benefits so she only has to work 1 job and can spend time with her children than half the other people that get these services. If someone truly disabled, I want to take care of that person. Someone is truly living in poverty and they are unable to sustain themselves because of some type of condition, let's take care of those people. We are compassionate. We want to take care of those who are downtrodden. But most of the entitlement programs were meant to be temporary. They were meant to be short-term in people's lives. Now they've become a way of life. And then we're constantly told that illegal immigrants aren't getting welfare either. They can't receive benefits. And that's a talking point. But the reality is there are 2 major pathways that they do get benefits from the welfare system. First of all, if an illegal immigrant has a child born here in the United States, that child is fully eligible for SNAP, Medicaid, WIC, housing vouchers, cash assistance in some states. Now, that child's not going to fill out the forms, right? And that child is not in control of those government benefits. Who fills out the forms? Well, it's the parents, and it's the far-left groups that have been set up to fill it out for these parents. And who controls the benefits? Well, it's the parents. So we pretend that a legal immigrant isn't receiving benefits, but the benefits flow directly to them. And then you have the bigger secret of all, the mixed status households. Illegal immigrants are counted in the household size for federal eligibility calculations. So if I'm living in a household and I'm a U.S. citizen and I have 8 people living in that household, including dependents, and 7 of those 8 are illegally here, well, they're still calculated in. So a single legal resident earning $45,000 would not qualify for certain benefits. But a legal resident earning $45,000 that's living with an illegal spouse and 2 illegal immigrant children, they will qualify because now they become a household of 4 and they meet the threshold incomes, the income thresholds. See how the game works? You have states like California and New York. They're also creating these parallel welfare programs. And specifically, they want to provide Medicaid-like coverage and even cash assistance to illegal immigrants. And not just that, they're also providing legal services given the ICE rates. So state taxpayers pick up the tab, and then what these states do is they cut essential services elsewhere to pay for funding of the illegal immigrants. And so you're getting screwed like 7 out of 10 ways. And if this wasn't enough, billions of dollars that could go to so many better things are just completely wasted. And you're paying twice. You pay through the state taxes, you're paying through your federal taxes, and again, the dependency grows even deeper. And let's combine that with the education crisis, right? Because this one really gets me. And I know education's not an entitlement program, socialist program, but not an entitlement program. But let's look at the education system. Because where's the anger? Where's the outrage? The United States spends $1.4 trillion a year. If we take local, state, and federal government, combine them, we spend $1.4 trillion a year. What do we get for that investment? What is our return on investment? Less than a third of students can read or write at grade level. Only 24% of 8th graders are proficient in math. History and civics essentially dead. Most students graduate functionally ignorant about their own country. Why aren't more people mad about that? Where's the anger? Where are the protests in the streets? You have all these fringe, and I guess I can't call them fringe anymore because it seems like it's the entire Democratic Party right now. But you have all these people protesting, defending those that are illegally here. Aren't you mad that an education system we're spending $1.4 trillion on can't educate our children? I mean, we would never accept this level of failure in any business, any agency, any industry in America. If a private company had a failure rate of 70 to 80%, it's going to collapse overnight. But when it comes to public education, no, let's keep writing bigger checks. Let's keep spending more and more money. And if we look at illegal immigration, think about it this way. In New York, taxpayers spend over $30,000 per student per year. In New York City, it's $40,000 per student per year. California, $20,000 per student per year. And I can go to Baltimore, Chicago, and a whole bunch of other places. Now imagine adding hundreds of thousands of non-English speaking students who are going to need extra help, who are going to need additional staff, translators, additional services. You think the system was trained before, it's broken now. And who's footing the bill? Well, it's you. You, the taxpayers. And you're told to shut up, sit down, be quiet, and just keep paying for this monstrosity of a failure. You know, the bigger point I'm trying to make is we can't even educate our children. And if we can't educate our children, what is it ultimately going to produce as adults? Well, it produces adults who depend on the government apparatus. If students can't read, if they can't write, if they can't think critically, if they have no understanding of America, no sense of responsibility, no belief in self-reliance, if they are non-functional in many ways, what do you think happens? Well, they're going to grow into adults who will struggle economically. They're going to grow into adults who are going to rely on government programs, who believe that the state must take care of them. And they're going to grow into adults that actually could go out and vote. And they're going to vote for more entitlements, expect the government to solve every problem. Remember what Mamdani said in his victory speech, that no problem is too big for the government to solve and no problem is too small for the government to consider. Dependency becomes culture. This is why the Founding Fathers warned repeatedly about the dangers of an uninformed public. Self-government requires self-reliance. Self-reliance requires you to be competent in life, and being competent requires a good education. We're failing on all three, and we're paying trillions of dollars for it. And it's not just the founding fathers who warned repeatedly. Listen to the great Rocky Balboa, who has a message to everyone out there.
Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. Now, if you know what you're worth, now go out and get what you're worth. But you gotta be willing to take the hits and not pointing fingers saying you ain't where you wanna be because of him or her or anybody. Cowards do that, and that ain't you.
Now, that's a message that everyone should hear. And I'm sorry, but I've started this podcast years ago, and I've always been trying to figure out a way to get a Rocky clip in, and I finally did. So you better have enjoyed that. But here's the truth. A nation that can't control its borders, that can't control its entitlement spending, that can't educate its children, is a nation that will not remain free. It might call itself free. You may be able to have your elections. You might say we're America, the land of opportunity. You might wave the flags on the 4th of July. But when people depend so much on the state, on the government apparatus for food, housing, healthcare, income, and identity, your freedom is gone. It's just symbolic. It's not real. And so the question becomes, everyone or a listener, answer honestly. Are we building a nation of self-governing citizens, or are we building a nation of dependents managed by a bureaucratic class, a political class? Because those are two very different futures. And only one of them resembles the country that the founders intended. Now, I hope you found this episode informative. Please take 30 seconds, write a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any other podcast platform that allows it, and share this episode with your family and friends. We really have to tackle these issues. We got to talk about it more. We got to talk about it openly and honestly. And we also have to accept that if we want to fix some of these problems out there, we're all going to have to give up something. We're all going to have to sacrifice a little bit. And during that period of sacrifice, life does get tougher, but we got to keep moving forward. We have to be honest with people, and we need more statesmen and women in Congress that will actually do that. Now, I want to thank you for joining me. I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com. And follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.